taking a trip to be with my Savior. I'm taking a trip to be
Welcome
with
to
my
you all.
friend.
We have just entered into Howard Finster's brain, and I'm going to be your guide as we walk through the divine clutter of this incredible artist, preacher, tinker, shaman's inner gray matter. We're going to get an insight into what really made Howard Finster tick, which is no easy matter because, as we will see as we walk through this room, this is not just a complex man, but someone who indeed was from another planet. So it's no easy matter to get a feeling for what really was going on inside his mind. It was an extraterrestrial mind. So let's start at the beginning in terms of Howard's presence on Earth, and probably the best thing to do is to observe the head of Howard here, a head that Howard himself produced for us, and it's indicative of the spirit of this room and the spirit of the man. Most people have a sense that part of the power of Howard's work is the juxtaposition of word and image. Words are everywhere. Words are around us in this room. I simply want to draw your attention to one thing. We see that in this image here of his head, and we also have a wonderful quotation from Howard, and he refers to himself as having a computerized brain. It was compartmentalized. In the image here, we see various small doors that he could open at will and could enter into different spaces, which allowed him to do the myriad things that he was capable of. So let's dwell on that image and then dwell, as I say, on the chronology of Howard Finster as his life unfolds. A poor person from a large family in northern Alabama, a small town, Valley Head, Alabama, and trace the steps of his emergence as, I think many would agree, the greatest of the so-called self-taught vernacular outsider artists of the 20th century. If we do that, we first have to encounter the mystery, the mythology of Howard Finster. That is, we have a problem at the very outset in terms of exactly when he was born. And there is, in fact, a debate currently as to which is the more accurate date, whether it's 1915 or 1916. I'm not going to go into the details on that, simply to say that we have decided to agree with the family's position on this, that it was 1916. For those that would like some more of the esoteric lore having to do with this mystery, we invite you to enter into the brain on your own. Let's take the trip now with Howard as he starts to develop as a preacher, as a born-again evangelical Christian, as a hard-working young boy. His father was someone who both had a farm and also worked in a lumber mill. Howard was always hardworking, was always possessed with a boundless curiosity. He was a tinkerer, he was a jack of all trades, and he was always experimenting with materials and things and ideas. He was a dreamer, and indeed, I think the theme of the show that we've been playing around with here in this video, that we are able to fly to these various islands of meaning that we associate with Howard. Flight is a theme that is very much a shamanistic theme. Howard, in fact, tells us that when he was young, he often dreamt that he was flying, and he describes quite eloquently the various flights that he would take out into the sky above the poverty that he was surrounded with, but he could dream of wondrous things, he could dream of other worlds. And all of that came to a significant point in his early life. Indeed, when, as he tells the story, he was only 3 years old, and he was out looking for his mother in the tomato patch, and he was calling for his mother and started to cry because he didn't know where she was. And he looked around and he started to look up, and suddenly he saw something. And as he describes it, or as he described it later, this was his first vision. He saw his sister descending on a stairway from the heavens and beckoning to him. And of course, the significance of this is that the sister that he saw, Abby, was someone that had died previously, in fact, had died of complications from rabies. And this was a very poignant moment, both in the memories he had of his sister, but also the realization that this was a sign of something greater in terms of his own destiny. And in fact, he says that when he looked back and reflected on the meaning of that event, he realized that indeed was a true sign from God that he was going to become a visionary artist. So this becomes a significant moment in his early life. Now, there are many things to talk about here, but let's simply refer to another key period in his early life, and that was, of course, if you are a Southern Baptist from a rural area, from a relatively poor background, the role that religion plays, especially that very intense form of religion that is characteristic of Southern Protestant tradition, plays a central role in people's lives. It certainly did in Howard Finster's life. And of course, the key event in that is not simply to say that you're a Christian, not simply to say that you believe certain things or that you go to church. It is, in fact, to be born again, to have an extraordinary experience of self-transformation and relationship with visitors from other planets, let us say, because, of course, Jesus, in a sense, was a visitor from another planet as well. And Howard tells us that, I think it's correct to say around the age of 12, that he has his first conscious experience of being born again. This, again, is a turning point in his life. He has a sense of destiny in terms of the fact that he is a conduit for something greater than he is individually, a conduit, in this case, for the Word of God, as communicated through the Bible. And he doesn't achieve this right away, but certainly the notion that he would become a preacher of God's Word becomes a significant factor for him. And his early life, in many ways, revolves around that theme. Never just that, however, because, as we said at the very beginning of his life, Howard was someone who was boundlessly curious about the world about him, and boundlessly curious about what can be done with the material aspects of the world. And we see one of his early clocks. He was experimenting with wood-burning techniques, toys that he made, and so on. All of this flows into, again, another dramatic period in his early life. And he decides one day that he needs to build a garden, or what he called at that time the Plant Farm Museum. Now, you will see, or you have seen, a very famous image, an iconic image, which is the Plant Farm Museum sign that he made to put in that first outdoor environment, and tells, again, the story of what he was doing. We're now in the late 60s. He's doing various things to make his living for himself and his family. And one of the things that he's doing is that he has a sense of helping the community and the children in the community. And now we've moved into the 70s. He's repairing bicycles, broken down bicycles for the community children, and repairing them. And now we have reached that mythic moment, the key event in terms of the story that he tells about his epiphany as an artist. That is in 1976. Usually it is said in January of 1976, and I'm going to recount the story that he most often tells, because there are variations on this, both that he told and then as they were translated by others. But the most common story is simply this, that he was getting ready to repair a bicycle, and he was testing out the paint he was going to use, and as he liked to say, he used whatever thrown away enamel paint was handy, and he had some white paint. And he dipped his finger in the white paint, and as he was going to test it on the frame, he brought his hand up, and a small face appeared in the paint in the tip of his finger. And Howard clearly was somewhat astounded by this, because not only did a small face appear, it winked at him, and it said, "Howard, this is God. I want you to paint sacred art." Howard, as again he tells the story, was indeed somewhat dumbfounded by this. He hadn't claimed before to speak regularly to God, although here we are speaking. He responds to God by saying, "God, you know, I always try to do what you want me to do, but you know, I've never done this, and I don't know if I can." And God looks at him, winks again, this tiny little face in the paint, and says, "Howard, how do you know if you haven't tried?" And again, as Howard says, "Gee, God, I guess you got me. I need to try." And he takes a dollar bill out of his wallet and nails it up on a shed that was there. And he paints his first painting, which, again, as legend would have it, is a picture of George Washington from the dollar bill. Now, again, myths are misshapen things, and they take on all sorts of different lives of their own. One of the wonderful things that we were able to include in Howard's brain here is this whole issue of exactly what it means to say something was the first. Equally interesting is this issue of what this first painting was, because he would say it was George Washington. But as we see here in Howard's brain, there were other images that he produced, each of which at some point he claimed to be his first painting. And it was quite exciting for us as we did our work with collectors. And we see another piece here, which is George Washington, but it's not so much a painting, but a piece of concrete that has been painted. And since he was a little bit nervous at this point as to what he really could claim or not claim, he very carefully indicates that this is the near to first work. And then, of course, someone else must have pointed out that he described it as an actual painting on a board, and this is a concrete piece. And we see there's another piece here. At one point, he had written on it the #1 painting, but then someone said, well, again, it's not George Washington. So we crossed that out, and we have close to Howard's first piece of art. A wonderful vignette on myth-making, if there ever was one. What is so impressive and amazing about Finster is the degree of passion and energy and compulsion or obsession, as many would put it, that emerges full-blown at this moment. There's an eruption of psychic, artistic, spiritual energy. Some would say, if you needed to draw a comparison, that there is a kind of latter-day shamanistic power that is manifesting through his work, through the very cells of his body. He goes into this obsessive state of producing art objects. He sleeps very little. He is in a kind of constant state of agitation and excitement about this new way to do God's work, a way that he realizes has a power that was missing when he was simply the preacher of words, that when he adds images to the words, there's a new degree of power and influence and significance that he's able to communicate. And that becomes very important to him. And anything potentially is art, And indeed, part of the power of what he is doing as an artist is, as he would put it, taking the things that have been thrown away by others that are essentially dead and giving them life again, giving them meaning, making them part of the message that God has for the rest of us. And again, without going into detail, we see the wonderful diversity and variety of that. He starts to take broken TV sets and melting them and making wonderful assemblages that have their own kind of funky power and interest. He does various techniques of printing, where he tries out methods using aluminum plates to produce serial objects that he is using again as a way to communicate his message, and so on. There is a whole thematic in his work in terms of found images. We see in this piece here, he started to experiment with dribbling oil on various surfaces, and then, in a sense, meditating over that imagery and seeing in the chaotic swirls that something emerges that has meaning, a face most often. The other, of course, theme that defines Howard Finster and defines him both in terms of his artwork and defines his vision, his religious vision, is in keeping with his background as a Baptist preacher. And what we're talking about, what we're looking at this point, is one of his works that is an apocalyptic work. If you ask what the message was that in the 80s he was attempting to communicate, it was that most important message for all of us infidels, that is, that we need to get right with the Lord, because the end is upon us, and the end is coming very soon. And that was a passionate concern of Howard Finster's in this period. The hell and damnation side of it tended to be most obvious in this period, in the 80s. And some would say, and I basically agree, that what's interesting about his evolution is that as he continued to evolve as an artist, the negative and heavy aspects of damnation that were so obvious in the early 80s and mid-80s became progressively less strident, less rigid. There was more of an ameliorative vision, more of a kind of compassion that overwhelmed the damnation. As we follow the timeline through the 80s, it's not simply that he is becoming progressively more adept at artistic technique. He's learning how to blend color, he's learning how to mix paints. He's doing this all on his own, and that is fascinating in its own right. But there's another significant event, and that's roughly in this period of the mid-80s, 85, 86, 87. This is when he's also becoming famous. This is a time when we talk about fame, he becomes a pop celebrity. Various rock bands in this period, like REM and Talking Head, for whatever reason, selected him as a kind of guru figure. He appeared on various popular TV programs, the most significant being the Johnny Carson program, and he became a cult celebrity in many ways. This is also the time that has an important connection with us here at Lehigh, because it is right about at this point in the mid-80s, or more specifically in 1985, that Ricardo Vera and I first encountered Howard Finster, and I will not go into the full story. It was a serendipitous event, a happy accident. We have here in the brain room the first folk computer art that Howard Finster did in 1986 at Lehigh University on an early generation graphics machine, an Amiga machine. Some people fondly remember their Amiga machines. There in fact is apparently something of a cult of Amiga machines on the internet. And we had Finster do the first of the computer folk art here at Lehigh University. But let's continue the story here. except I'm tempted to point out one other thing that is expressive of Howard Finster. He was, as we see here, the folk artist, he was the preacher, he was the tinkerer, he was the jack of all trades. He was also something of a folksy philosopher poet. And when he hit his stride, he was capable of some wonderfully rhapsodic and poetic phrases and sentiments. And one of the most famous is from one of the signs he had in the garden, something that is now owned by the High Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. I took the pieces you threw away and put them together, as he said, by night and day, washed by rain, dried by sun, 1,000,000 pieces all in one. And that certainly has a lilt to it. It certainly has a rhythm. It certainly has a sentiment that's a significant sentiment. And if that is a message from God, it's a good message from God that even those of us that perhaps still fall into the category of infidels should take to heart. So as we go through the timeline spinal cord, and I think as you've been viewing this, you have probably been struck by the fact that what I have been referring to as the timeline, and we see the dates, etc., that are important, seems to have some reference to this wonderfully sinuous and somewhat strange snake-like line that goes around the entire room. So here we are. We're moving through the 80s. He's at the peak of his fame. Fame is, in some cases, starting to get the better of him. As we know, he is still trying to get the message out, and the more messages that he gets out, the better. The issue of knowing exactly how many messages he has gotten out became increasingly important to him. I think many people will know that at a certain point, by the late 70s, early 80s, he starts to number all of his works. And we see some of that kind of obsessive concern for the quantity of his output. We have one of his number sticks here, where he not only numbered each individual piece, but he kept a record of the production that he was involved in at any one point in time. So here we are, and as he's becoming more famous, he is having to step up production to meet the demand, and he was most willing to do that. But of course, he's an old man as well, and both his health as well as the pressures on him are starting to become overwhelming. I want to draw attention to one other thing here, which is you will see a screen that is showing a video. This is a video done in July of 2001, and it's a very haunting video because it's one of the last, if not the last, recorded or videotaped conversations with Howard Finster. Often the problem for those that try to film Howard Finster is that as an old-time preacher, he would go into a preaching harangue and you couldn't shut him up. And sometimes that just became too much. This has a special poignancy because he's not in his preaching mode. He's in a much more reflective conversational mode. It's clear there's a kind of sadness that he's working with. And it's a very touching episode in terms of what was going through his brain at that particular moment. Both, as I say, a kind of sadness and, in a sense, also still seeing the greatness that is in him. At this point, we're moving into the 90s, and I think the one thing that is worth saying is that this is the culmination of those darker forces that we alluded to as he became more and more famous. And it was in the 90s that because of his fame, he had to retreat from his paradise garden, that the demands on his time were simply, as I said before, overwhelming, And his dear wife, Pauline, had the good sense to tell him, you know, Howard, we've got to find a place where we can lead our own lives again, and you can do the work you need to do. As I said, we're talking now about the 1990s, and I suppose I want to make one important point, which is this, that I suggested that we could characterize the 90s as the waning period of his career. He had peaked at some point in the 80s. That was his masterwork period. Fame starts to overwhelm him, family intrigue, health problems, collectors who were no longer pleased with his output because they saw it as no longer the kind of interesting work that he was doing in the 80s. He was in a sense copying himself and producing small works that were essentially works for the tourist trade. Some would say, in fact, that a way to periodize his career as an artist is to think of the period in the 80s when he was producing most of his truly interesting works as the tractor enamel period, as he referred to the paint that he was using at that time, and the fact that indeed things were painted with a brush. As he grew older and as his health deteriorated, he found it harder and harder to hold a brush steady, and he realized that if he was going to maintain the output, he had to switch to some other form. And he switched, and this is again, the nomenclature becomes controversial. Some would call it the Sharpie period, or the laundry marker period, or as he preferred, the paint pen period, because he always, when this issue was brought up, and some would bring this up to say that his work had deteriorated, he would quickly come back and say that's not necessarily the case at all. I'm using very expensive paint pens, and they're the equal of any kind of enamel paint I was using earlier. And we have some things here being displayed that indicate the fact that he still was capable of producing truly intriguing and wonderful objects, whimsical objects, more serious objects. Some of the icons in terms of his cosmology or pantheon reappear. Elvis Presley, of course, being one of the key figures, but we see other things as well. The angel, of course, is ever present, but also, as we see here on the wall, Mickey Mouse being another addition to the pantheon. We also tried to show here some of the implements of his work. He was very self-conscious about that. One of the very interesting pieces here on the wall is at one point he gathered up some of the pencils and pens and brushes that he had been using and did an assemblage with them, which again has its own striking and fascinating qualities, and again is very expressive of him as an artist and him as a human being, as well as wonderful other objects here on the shelves. His paint pens that we were referring to. Nothing ever went to waste, so all of the drippings from his earlier phase where he used enamel paint into paint cans, he would then suddenly start seeing faces and he would produce an art object out of the drippings from his painting. As we move then towards the turn of the millennium, fame is still very much a part of his life, but in many ways his health was deteriorating and it was becoming increasingly difficult for him not to dwell on the fact of his own coming death and the fact that, as he would put it, he was going to have to return to that other world that he came from. And of course, we're talking about the turn of the millennium. So for an old-time Baptist preacher who was baptized in the blood of the Lamb and was concerned with the apocalyptic message of getting right with the Lord because the end is upon us, what more symbolic moment would anyone want to live through than the passage from the 20th to the 21st century, which he does. Although, as I indicated earlier, it is perhaps worth saying that for all of the intense apocalyptic of the earlier period and the thought that here we are at the turn of the millennium, that this would have sparked a new intensity in his apocalyptic message, that really didn't happen. There was a mellowing of Howard by this time for all sorts of reasons. That brings us to the last wall here in Howard's brain, a wall that, in terms of the cord that connects and lays out his life, the spinal cord, the snake, the timeline. As we see here, quite interestingly, it morphs into a very famous symbol for those that know something about medieval alchemical tradition. It morphs into the Ouroboros, the primordial snake that consumes or eats its own tail. The theme that the end is always a new beginning. In this case, the end, Howard's end, really was a return to the world of spirit, a world, as he put it, where he no longer had to work himself to death to produce messages, masterworks, art for the rest of us, because up in heaven, God is the only artist, and they're all masterworks, so he doesn't have to worry about that any longer. We also see, as we indicate here, this increasing sense of his own messianic destiny, not just that he was chosen, but that he was chosen to suffer for the rest of us. So in some of the imagery that he produces throughout this period, there is a sense of his own immolation, his own crucifixion, his own sacrifice, in a sense, for the rest of us. Some would call that a Christ complex, and as a matter of fact, it is. And even better, as a way to end the imagery in his brain, and one can certainly imagine this happening. We have this wonderful painting by a California artist, Kata Billups, and the wonderful image, in a sense, to close out this tour of Howard's brain is the image here of Howard giving Jesus Christ a tour of Paradise Garden. And what I think is so both haunting and touching and evocative of something that really has significance here is the expression, in this case, on Jesus' face. Jesus is clearly dumbfounded by what this stranger from another world has accomplished. And as you can see, Howard is just carrying on. He's telling Jesus to look over there, then look around at what else he's done, and Jesus is clearly finding it difficult to keep up with Howard. Well, that's telling us something about all of those messengers from outer space that punctuate the history of human culture. Jesus and Howard and Buddha and Elvis are all part of the same lineage.
I'm taking a trip to be with my friend. I'm taking a trip just to be with my Jesus. I'm taking a trip just to be a